got a simple question. Do you think inflation matching, let's not worry for the moment about overinflation, but inflation matching pay rises are a realistic thing to demand?
Yeah, I think it is, because I think when you look at the inflation that we're experiencing at the moment, it's not coming from wages. We're not seeing a wage price spiral. What we're seeing is a price-wage spiral. What we're seeing is workers responding in their wage requests or demands, call it what you will, to the economic landscape. And the inflation that we've got has largely been caused as a result of the opening up of the economy after the pandemic, as a result of the war in Ukraine. But there's another facet to it that people rarely talk about, which is naked profiteering that is going on at the moment. We are seeing companies whacking up their prices in an attempt to increase their profits, when actually there's no real justification for them doing it. And even as energy and gas and oil prices are now starting to tumble, you're still seeing some of those companies maintaining their prices. So what I think we're seeing is something that some pundits have coined as greedflation. And instead of arguing that the onus should be on workers to show wage restraint and to accept a fall in real wages and a fall in living standards, perhaps the responsibility should be on some of these big companies to show a bit of profit restraint.
Yeah, and we've debated this very topic. Keen viewers will know about greedflation. I am a capitalist, but I do favour responsible capitalism. And I think what's going on at the moment with profiteering in some cases is quite irresponsible. But, and don't worry everyone, I won't open this can of worms again, I do think everyone demanding all these long lockdowns and all these companies, they did have hits to their profits in some instances, so now some of them are trying to claw it back, but don't worry, I won't open my COVID can of worms. Let's bring it back on track. The pay rise, inflation levels, do you think that's reasonable for people to want? Well, you can want whatever you want, but do you think it's a reasonable thing to actually be looking to receive?
So I think it's a very rational thing to ask for. As Paul's saying, as we all are very aware, there are very large numbers of people who are really struggling to, not to particularly live a luxurious life, but just to pay basic bills. So I think it's very rational. Do I think it's reasonable? I think this is a really difficult question to answer, because if you're on a low income and you are struggling, then it probably is quite reasonable to expect to have a bit more of a generous pay settlement. If actually you're on a slightly higher salary or even a high salary, then actually I'm not sure it is quite as reasonable to be asking for that. And I think, ultimately, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector or for charities, which is another category we often don't talk about, where they're clearly not able to, profiteer or do anything else that's going to get more money in, there has to be some constraint because they have to pay bills. And therefore, I'm not sure it is always reasonable to expect that you can get an inflation matching pay rise. Certainly, my organisation is a small charity. I wouldn't be able to afford to pay the full inflation amount. I was as generous as I could be. But I do think the point about companies behaving badly and using high inflation as an excuse to raise prices, in fact, well beyond the inflation impact. We have a newspaper subscription. I will not name the newspaper, but it is a very mainstream newspaper, who have just put up their prices by 25%. And when I asked them how they justified that, they just said, oh, well, HQ are requiring that because of inflation. Well, that's 2.5 times inflation, so that's not a reasonable price rise. So I think there is definitely something in that.
Well, the government never criticises, businesses and companies who decide to put their prices up for the reasons they cite. Well, we're living in the world of inflation, our overheads, our costs have gone up, therefore we've got to pass that on to the customer. Now, what the government says is, OK, that's entirely rational, that's what happens in business. But the same principle applies, surely, to a worker. If a worker is experiencing a fall in living standards as a result of rampant inflation, then it's entirely reasonable for that worker to say, well, do you know what, my labour charge has gone up because I'm being hit by higher costs, and therefore it's reasonable for me to be able to meet those costs. I have to put up my labour charge. And what the government says in the first case is, well, you know, we have to accept that businesses will put prices up. It's entirely reasonable and rational thing to do. But in the second case, they say, oh, well, no, that's outrageous. The worker shouldn't put his or her labour charge up. No, that's unreasonable. The worker's got to show restraint. What does the worker think he's doing? You know, in an age of inflation, demanding inflation levelling pay increases. And that is the hypocrisy, I think, at the heart of conservative philosophy when it comes to the distinction they draw, the unfair distinction they draw, particularly in a scenario like this one with inflation, between business and between workers.
I'm not sure that is entirely fair, as you might expect me to say, because I think there are different things that are being conflated there. So actually, there'll be plenty of people in the government. Indeed, there have been plenty of people in the government who have been criticising some companies relying on, for example, welfare top-ups rather than paying decent wages that people can live on. You've got to remember this was also the government that has just significantly increased the national living wage. So I don't think that is entirely fair. I also don't think you've got a government that's going around saying, yeah, you know, companies can whack up whatever prices they want. And actually, in this scenario, it's the Bank of England, which is an independent entity, that is telling people that they should be more restrained in the
yeah, but one of the reasons that the Bank of England are doing this, they've literally got one job, the Bank of England, essentially, which is to keep inflation to its 2% target.
Absolutely.
They've failed monumentally. So instead of actually sitting there looking inwards and going, you know what, you rumbled me, I failed at my job, what they're actually doing is getting your fault, your fault, your fault, and by the way, it's definitely your fault as well.
That's a problem with handing control of monetary policy to the Bank of England and saying, as you said, Michelle, your only job is essentially price stability, because they will then see everything through the prism of price stability. What does that mean? It means holding down wages. It means whacking up interest rates if necessary. What does that mean for demand in the economy? What does it mean for investment? What does it mean for businesses to be able to thrive and borrow money? What does it mean for competitiveness? Even if all of those things take a hit, as long as the Monetary Policy Committee can say, well, we've done our job because we've hit the inflation target, then that's ultimately all they're interested in. That's why we need, in my view, control of monetary policy restored to democratic control of government.
Even aside from whatever your view is of the independence of the Bank of England, and we won't get into the market volatility that we saw when there were suggestions not long ago that might change, but certainly the markets did not respond well, which does have implications for people's wages, for people's ability to pay mortgages, etc. So there's a knock-on impact of that. But setting that aside, you know, as you pointed out, this cost of living crisis we're in was totally foreseeable because of the pent-up demand that was created in the pandemic. Totally foreseeable. And the Bank of England did nothing to try and get ahead of what has happened. So even if you know, let's set aside the debate of the independence and just say, well, that was their job. They have, you're right, they've absolutely failed on taking action in a timely manner to try and prevent this.
Then will there be any accountability for that failure? No, there will not.
My concern as well is
Make it a brief concern, because I want to ask you about something else.
Really brief. We've got a stagnant economy. The economy's flatlining. We could potentially tip into a recession at one point. The last thing we should be doing is reducing people's disposable incomes. What we need to do is get real wages rising, keep demand high, because the last thing we want is that vicious circle where we see low growth or no growth, and then all of a sudden we see unemployment, businesses laying people off because they're not making any profits, higher welfare claims. That's the sort of thing that we need to avoid. And we should have learned the lessons, frankly, from the 1930s about how you avoid, you know, serious recessions. But it seems that we're still, even all these years later, making those same mistakes.
Richard says, oh, Michelle, you're talking about greedflation, but what you're talking about here is capitalism. And he says there's pros and cons to it, but he says it is the best system that there is. One of the things that caught my eye yesterday, whenever it was, is the RMT holding a strike on, I think it's a Eurovision final, the day of the Eurovision final. Now, I will hold my hands up. I am not a Eurovision viewer. It's not my kind of thing.
Good.
No, I'm not. But it's not for me, the whole Eurovision thing. But notwithstanding that, there is a war in Ukraine. In this country, we've extended the hands of everything, really. Money, homes, all the rest of it. Apparently, we're on the shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. You know, we're doing absolutely everything to help them and all the rest of it, including hosting the Eurovision, because it wasn't safe to do so in Ukraine. When I then look at the RMT trying to then disrupt people that are into the Eurovision, that do want to be in Liverpool to celebrate all the rest of it, what do you think to that? Do you think it's a good move to stop people trying to be part of that?
I think the problem is, Michelle, well, if you can call a strike on any day in this country and there will always be something happening. There will always be an event going on somewhere that is going to be impacted by the strike, let's be blunt. And so in many respects, unions are in a no-win situation. I mean, I've been on strike.
But this seems to me very much like a deliberate targeting of that event, that you're targeting an event that we're hosting on behalf of a war-torn country.
Well, let me say this. Even if it is, then I think we would all have to understand, look, if you are a union and you're trying to maximise pressure on your employer to make a reasonable offer before you take strike action, you are going to employ tactics that increase your leverage to the maximum amount, aren't you? You can't expect any union to say, OK, we're going to take strike
with
action.
With no morality?
Well, I don't...
Because don't you think it feels like a little bit wrong? And I have to say, I'm not into Eurovision. I am not sitting here defending Eurovision. It's not my thing. But for a lot of people, it is their thing. And it is quite symbolic that this year, at the cost of tens of millions, I think it's going to be costing the BBC, something like that, we have generously hosted this event on behalf of this war-torn country. Someone, Con, at the start of the show says there's nothing positive going on at the moment in this world. There is a big positive thing. The union wants to disrupt it for its own ends. Well, I think that is pretty selfish.
By definition, taking strike action is disruptive. There will always be a level of disruption.
There's levels. So why did they cancel? Because weren't they planning to do something on the coronation weekend?
Well, but look...
But then they decided to cancel it.
Unions will always decide tactics that they think, as I said before, will maximise their leverage. That is not unreasonable. Just as, by the way, employers in response will always choose their own tactics which try to undermine the leverage of the union. Now, of course, what unions have to do is make sure that when they set strike dates or employ tactics, they don't alienate the public too much, because then public support collapses and they could end up losing the dispute. So this is obviously a judgment called by the RMT. But
I'll throw it open to you to be the judge of. Don't forget as well, and I know it's not RMT before you start getting in touch saying I don't know what I'm talking about, but ASLEF, the FA Cup as well. It looks like that will be disrupted. Are you a football fan? Does that matter to you or not? Your thoughts in all the usual ways.